Yes, thank you, Christina, so much for hosting us. So this is my book that I wrote, Fade to Light, How I Learned to Dissolve Darkness. And I'm going to be reading a few short passages as well as an entire chapter. Because it does span 30 years, it's to read just one little snippet feels like I'm sort of cheating you a little bit on a whole bunch of story. So we start talking more to give you the language of the religion that I was raised in and part of my origin story of leaving it. As brothers and sisters, we had a responsibility to care for each other. If one of us rented from the other, the expectation was to provide as low a rent as possible. The guideline was to not profit from each other. We'd employ each other when possible. There was an expectation that we'd help each other move, help each other get to church, and hand-me-downs were passed through the congregation's children to save each other money. It was a good community to be a part of. Very simply put, people who were part of our church organization had the truth and were good. Anyone outside of it was bad. We didn't call them bad people, though. We referred to them as worldly. As Jesus had instructed his followers to be in the world but not of it, we lived in the truth, and unbelievers were part of the world. I have given your word to them, but as the world has hated them, because they are no part of the world, just as I am no part of the world. From the Bible, you know that book? John 17 and 14. It was weird to look those up for this book. Ooh, well, I found it really quick. Well, that's in there. I'll give you some examples of how these terms peppered our language. I'm in the truth. My friend is in the truth. That person left the truth and isn't my friend anymore. So next, let's try in world and worldly. The teacher at school is worldly. That person has a worldly husband, or she's in the world. So the truth is with God. The devil, aka Satan, rules the world. It was a simple yet important delineation that defined my life until I chose to follow my own path. Hi, Lisa. Our mandate was to preach and share the truth as often as possible. We had two ways to do this. First was by the example we set when we were interfacing with the world, and second was the literal preaching work that we did to bring the message to people in their homes by showing up at their front door. Within the binary of the truth being good and the world being bad lay a scale. Everything and everyone can be placed on this spectrum. Worldly people technically couldn't be good like us, so they're all varying degrees of bad. There are those that we've already reached with our preaching, but they turned it down. Then there were those who hadn't been exposed to our teachings. They were who we were out looking for when we went knocking on doors. It was important to ensure as many people as possible were given the chance to opt in for paradise. According to the last book of the Bible, called Revelation, Jesus would return to earth soon to smite the unbelievers in Armageddon. Then he'd work with us to transform earth into a paradise. I remember asking about what would happen to the worldly people who never got the chance to learn the truth. It didn't seem fair to me that they would still be destroyed if they hadn't had an opportunity to make a decision. God can read the heart, I was told, which sufficed for my understanding as a child. Not only was I acutely aware that God could read my heart at any given moment, I also knew that I couldn't be a judge of character to pick out the almost good unbelievers. It was important to not spend any time with anyone who wasn't in the truth, unless we were actively preaching to them. I was pretty annoying. Preaching was good. We did that a lot. Going preaching is called service, as in we're going in service on Saturday morning. We met every Saturday morning to split into smaller carpool groups and to go knock on doors in the selected area for the day. My favorite part was the coffee break at one of the local Tim Hortons shops. I always got a donut and a hot chocolate. So we were God's chosen ones, his rules for us were clear, and there were donuts involved. Yes, I would have told you I was a very happy child indeed. There's our intro in your language. Okay, so I'm going to read you the full chapter, Team Devil. And I picked this chapter. You'll see there's some reasons why I really want to be able to read this to this group at this stage of my life. I also don't need these for reading, and they're just falling down because they look great, but when I'm sitting up. That was me taking off my glasses. Team Devil. When my lease for the dark basement apartment ended, I got a huge step up to a new place in a 3-story brown brick building built in the 1950s in Kitsilano. Kitsilano is an oceanside neighborhood in Vancouver with parks, beaches, and mature trees lining the streets. It wasn't as urban as my first neighborhood, quieter, walking distance to cute shops. The houses across the street from my new place were multi-million-dollar oceanfront homes, some owned by celebrities. The beach was less than a block away. The wall-to-wall windows along the front of the apartment provided light and space to breathe. I was only one bus ride away from the office. Things were looking up. It was from that 1950s walk-up apartment with the yellow kitchen sink and avocado green fridge that I blew up at my mom. They had cut off my brother Jeremy and his family. He lived only a 15-minute drive away from Mom and Dad. He had 3 little boys, my nephews, all under the age of 10. Years had passed since my brother had been my primary support in my departure from the truth. He was still working towards leaving the truth. Come on in. So this is in Vancouver as well. There's you can see we've moved a lot. Okay. So years
If I may ask, ma'am, these notes, are they coming from diary? Did you make diaries at the time? Like I'm doing a similar project and doing it from diary recall. Is that how you did this book?
Not really, but let's definitely talk about that
Okay.
once I finish the reading, and my subconscious is going to process an answer, and I'll be able to answer you super quick. I promise. Years had passed since my brother had been my primary support in my departure from the truth. He was still working towards leaving the truth. He wanted to take Mom and Dad with him. He spent years studying how to reason with people who have been brainwashed into cult membership, with a specific focus on how to reason with members of the truth. Jeremy dropped by to see Dad one evening when he was feeling strong enough to broach the topic. Dad invited him in, and they sat together in the living room. I picture the two of them sitting opposite one another in the late 1990s Wedgwood blue and dusty rose tones of a room that was just starting to show its age. He was careful to reason with Dad as an equal, and came equipped with facts. He described how the truth is powered by a wealthy corporation. He knew about how their legal team worked to cover up the numerous cases of child abuse. I never looked to re-establish ties with any former truth people, even though they were now worldly like me. Jeremy, on the other hand, felt it was important to connect with the others who had woken up and rejected our upbringing. During his search, he found that there were 2 known pedophiles in our old congregation. I wish I could say I was shocked when he told me, but instead I felt relief that I wasn't one of their victims. Jeremy and Dad talked for over an hour. My brother felt that he left the conversation on a good note. Dad told him he'd always be his son and would give some thought to what they'd talked about. Jeremy called me right away to share how good it felt that he had approached our parents with love. He felt he had been heard and had made an impact. A few days later, Dad relayed the opposite sentiment to Jeremy. He and Mum wouldn't be able to see him or his family any longer if their decision was to leave the truth. It was the beginning of the end. When I found out that my parents had shunned my brother and his family, I felt livid. Sure, we had our own understanding to avoid truth-related subjects, but for them to overtly shun their own grandchildren felt like too much. How dare they? The anger consumed me. I had to tell my parents what I thought of their decision. I have since come to understand that anger is a vessel that carries other emotions. I used to see the vessel, recognize it as anger, and not open the lid to see what it was delivering. The main motivation for that day for me was shame. I felt ashamed that my parents would choose not to see their grandchildren. Maybe getting mad was comfortable to me since I saw a lot of that growing up. I didn't know how to move past anger. I didn't know how to process the other, even less comfortable emotions like shame and fear. I know now that it's wise to peek inside the anger vessel to see what other emotions it's masking. But back then, my anger felt justified. I called home for what would be the penultimate time my mother answered my phone call. After some terse pleasantries were exchanged, I dug in. "If I had a baby," I asked her, "would you be there when I gave birth?" She didn't have an answer for me. Wasn't a daughter supposed to have her mother nearby when she too transitioned to motherhood? My 30th birthday was approaching, and my maternal instinct had started to make itself known. The invincible days of my early 20s of climbing, drinking, Getting injured and ignoring the pain were fading. My body subtly alerted me to the tender fact that my reproductive parts held the possibility of bringing a new life into being. This aspect of myself was getting more vocal since I first heard it that night alone in my tent in Alabama early in my road trip. The idea of becoming a mother was scary. Again, instead of feeling into the fear and apprehension, I focused on the more accessible emotion, anger. As I paced back and forth in my living room, I cried and asked how she could reject her own grandchildren. I explained how I was just beginning to become aware of my own maternal instinct. I walked her through how I, as a potential mother, could not imagine the choice to reject one's children. How could she spend all that time nurturing us, providing for us, ensuring we're warm and fed, and making sure we got our high school education? How could she reject her living grandchildren for the sole reason that their parents had researched the religion and chose a different path? This was insanity. I used to be familiar with the rules and customs of the truth. I grew up embedded in them, after all. But my decade of freedom in the world had distanced me from their reality. When I saw it in action, my own family formally breaking apart due to a religious technicality, it felt wrong. I stepped in, as if I were stepping out into traffic to stop a car crash already in motion. In Jeremy's conversation, he opened a door to Mum and Dad. Beyond it lay the possibility to question the truth together and be a family outside of its rules. As he drove away, he felt proud. Jeremy felt like he was seen by Dad as an equal, as a fellow adult. The door of possibility was wide open. Dad closed it and kept Mum with him on the other side. In this phone call, I opened the door to slam it in her face. I attempted to reason with my mom with logic. I remembered how people in the truth were working for their reward to live forever in a God-created paradise. Armageddon seemed like a movie with coming soon trailers and announcements that kept missing the release date. I broke it down for her that no one actually knows what happens when we die. Why not embrace that we're all alive? It all made perfect sense to me. We, her children and grandchildren, were still here in the flesh. I wanted her to act on what she knew instead of unproven afterlife theories. I didn't realize that by presenting this line of reasoning, I was directly challenging her faith. Yes, I was angry, hurt, and ashamed when I called her, but did I really think that I could talk her out of the way of life she had chosen almost 40 years prior? I had forgotten about how the truth trained us regularly to defend our faith. What I thought was an attempt to reason with logic came across as a clear attack on her beliefs and faith in God. Oops. She cried and begged me to stop saying those things. I persisted. "Get behind me, Satan." She quoted Jesus at me from the Bible in Matthew 16 and 23. By challenging my mother's faith, I showed to her that I was part of Satan's world. With their binary beliefs, I could either be part of God's organization or on Team Satan. To be part of the world meant that it was easier to be possessed by the devil because I no longer had God's protection. For her, demonic forces were speaking through me. Up to that point, I still called my parents every so often. The unspoken rule was that I didn't talk openly about my life of sin, and they didn't ask me about my status in the truth. I imagine that on that day my mother was able to recognize that I was no longer her daughter. I can see that my call to her supported the decision for them to reject and shun me. To leave the truth is bad, but to then speak ill of it is considered apostasy. It's the worst possible offense. My fade charade was over. Her Bible quotation of "Get behind me, Satan" was directed both at me personally and at the devil forces that were clearly speaking through me to challenge her faith that day. I didn't mean to make her cry. We didn't speak again for years. R.I.P. the relationship with my mother, 2008. Okay, I've got one more. This is just a short one called Our Echo. So you can see we've moved towards the end of the book. Our Echo. Immediately following Naomi's death, I noticed how the shock reverberated around the community, like an echo persisting after a loud sound. It was as if the news triggered a shockwave that muffled the ability to talk about anything else. Naomi was gone. The echo resounded. Gone, gone, gone. At first, conversations were one of two topics, either reminiscing about Naomi or talking about how life without her was going. Over time, each person settled into a way to carry her forward in their hearts and thoughts. It's as if the news wasn't deafening anymore, and they could hear the soundtrack to their life again. The vibration carried them, on their own time, to their new reality where their friend no longer existed. The resonance of Naomi's echo was crisp and clear for quite a while. People continued to share stories and Naomiisms for years after she died. She's still mentioned in any conversation I have with someone that knew her. My observation of Naomi's echo shaped my theory of what happens to us when we die. I feel that our life force is dissipated with the wind. Our personality and body cease to exist, but our spirit lives on in the memories of others. This freshly defined understanding of life after death triggered me to face my own echo. I wondered how my presence would reverberate, and for how long. Who would carry my spirit forward? What aspects of me would be preserved in memory? Was I forgettable? There were so many people at Naomi's funeral. How many people would come to mine? What stories would they tell? Years earlier, when I soaked in Eastern philosophy during my newfound yoga obsession, I read a few books exploring Zen Buddhism. From those books, I learned the concept of the observer role. When we step into the observer role of our life, we watch things unfold as if in a movie. This makes it easier to stay curious instead of thinking we're in control of every detail. I incorporated the perspective of the observer into my echo study. I wanted to see how my existence was experienced by others. It wasn't that I thought I could dictate the script of my life's movie. No, I wanted to see if I could design how the audience felt after the movie, my life, was over. Observing my life with an eye to gauge my impact was not an easy exercise. I realized that most of my legacy at that time centered around my sense of humor and my unique curly hair. She's funny. Great hair. Is that it? My humor was such a thin slice of the whole that is Jessica. I craved the safety to explore my sensitive side, to be soft, the way I acted at class to teach yoga. Navigating conversations littered with sarcasm and so-called witty banter took extra energy. I found them exhausting, but I loved the attention it got me. I knew I was funnier and more entertaining with a few drinks, but deep down I knew that alcohol wasn't healthy for me, mentally or emotionally. The lows I could experience after a really fun party night sometimes triggered suicidal contemplation. I wanted to stop drinking, but was hooked on the connections that I made at parties. Back then, I preferred that people reminisce about that fun time drinking with me than to not have anything to reminisce about at all. Another branch of my love project sprouted. I needed to go beyond just telling myself, I love you. I wanted to feel proud of my echo, of who I was, of how I would be remembered. Who am I, anyway? To unravel and find my authentic self took me on a deep dive through layers of complexity. It was like repurposing a piece of paper from one origami design to another, as if I had been folded into a specific shape from childhood by my upbringing. In order to design how I wanted to be known and remembered, I needed to unfold from that shape. As I smoothed each crease, I considered the story it told. My own history lay before me as I worked to shape myself into who I wanted to be, what I'm living in memories. Whatever shape I was folding towards, it wasn't going to be familiar. Can I design my life to leave a smoldering hole where my existence once was? How many people have I truly let know me? I intentionally decided to let in a few friends, all the way in. I chose those that I felt unconditionally loved and supported by. They're still with me, especially while I've been writing this book. To know that they were along for the ride no matter what has brought me deep comfort. What a beautiful gesture to commit to know each other until one of us transitions to a memory-based existence. I carefully selected aspects of my personality that I wanted to enhance. I then invested heavily in those personality traits in order to seed the strength of memories that would one day bind those whom I left behind. I imagined friends gathered at my celebration of life, sharing stories about me that they didn't know they had in common. It felt clever. It felt clever to conceptualize my life's echo and design a methodology to manage it. I can see now that I was over-intellectualizing my fear of death. I thought I was being wise, like studying a map to select the best path through the mountains. I was preparing myself for the journey, right? But even the best trip plan is only theory until you're actually walking the trail. Instead of savoring the day-to-day, it was like I couldn't look up from the map. I couldn't get to where I wanted to go because there was always a better memory to seed. It's only when I look back now that I can see the level of discontent that I introduced with my eco design concept. I thought I was being smart about my healing. It took years to create a life that I felt proud of. Thank you. You can't get up.
I can't get up.
Thank you. Hi.
So we've got time. If anybody has any questions for Jess, curiosities about her process or what she's written about.
I have a question, Jessica, about, I just can't imagine how devastating it must have been to be shunned by your mom, just because of her religion. And I'm just wondering, how did you deal with that? Did you have a support of any kind at the time, or besides your brother, or?
The first word that comes to mind is drugs. I escaped a lot. Yeah, I took, the shunning was really subtle at first. Like I allude to it about we'll talk, but we don't talk about the religion, and it was kind of light, and then slowly but surely it felt, okay, this is actually shunning, until it was formal. So that was the formal conversation where we stopped speaking, and then there was another one where we were at there was a worldly family person's funeral that my parents went to over 10 years later. I hadn't seen them for 10 years. Excuse me. And that's when I felt that it was the best for me to formalize it. It was actually, it was more empowering rather than dancing and not being able to be myself. I'm just not going to talk about this, and I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to have all these shadows that I know they can't handle. It was just accept me, or
You're out of luck.
Yeah, and we did. My brother left on his own terms, and we, in our own ways, tried to see if maybe they would also maybe leave and everything. It definitely didn't happen quickly. It was over a decade, and so I don't know that I had specific support. I don't know if it's my personality or if it's because of these experiences that I tend to skew towards independence, because I've done so much of this just flat out on my own. Yeah.
Well, just your courage is inspiring.
Oh, thank you. Gotta be me.
Amen, sister.
Amen.
I'm very taken by your story. I wonder if the approach of a memoir was for you to dive deep into yourself, or did you feel like it was a story that you had to tell?
I definitely didn't want to tell the story. When I moved to BC, I didn't tell anyone my past. I came up with all of these ways that if someone said, oh, where does your family live, that I had like a really light weight to answer and then shut it down. Or they'd say, oh, how often do you see your parents? And I had like a specific pat response to close the conversation without having to share why we hadn't talked, and if we, like, just why we hadn't talked and how long it had been since I had seen them. And so the memoir, I moved here from Squamish to change my life to write my book, and I tried a couple different books I wanted to write about what I had learned in my healing from the 5 elements. I've got a sketchbook. on things like that, about what I'd learned from going deep on my self-love. I call it the love project, of telling myself I love you, of treating myself like someone I am in love with. I wanted to just be like, 10 easy steps to be in love with yourself, like, right? Like, buy my book, hire me, like, take me to your seminar. And, well, just crap. This is the story that had to come out. And it, and it went so deep in healing for me, which, ever wish that you could just be done healing and be like, bing, just like the microwave timer light, whatever you want to call the washing machine just goes off. But it was enough a phase of healing that now I'm a mom. And so here I am in my 40s, having so many times said, I'm not gonna have kids. I don't want to risk it. Like, what if they leave me? What if I don't want to risk it? 2008, well, if my mom's not gonna, how can I be a mom if I don't have a mom? And all of these things. And I just feel like sharing that in the first manuscript, there were like 3 different points where I talked about when I decided not to have children. But every time I wrote that, it felt very disingenuous and very like it was a story that I'd been telling myself. And slowly I pulled those mentions out. And then I was pregnant with my first child as I finished the manuscript, and he's now 6 months old. So it's like just an interesting path that unfolded. That the book's not a bestseller yet, but that's not even the point anymore. It was written, and then my life to be able to have my own family evolved really naturally. So yeah, I tried not to write this book. I felt embarrassed, right? I still felt shame. I felt embarrassed. I didn't want people to look at me and go, cult survivor. Because that's like maybe that much of the book is upbringing and some of that cult stuff. It's not an expose. It's not about the truth. It's not, I went deep.
It's a triumph of self-love.
It really is. It really, really is. And the last version of the manuscript, being able to go back and say, and what I learned here, looking back, I can see that. Like the anger vessel thing was like, that's why I told off Mom. That's what was below. Because I've read books before that I feel are still really early in the process for some aspects. And if I had written it then, it would have been like, can you even believe my mother, blah, 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 and I want you to be mad at her with me, right? But with this, I can say, shoot, she chose her way, and we had this conversation, and I didn't handle it with grace, and I was acting from anger, which was the primary emotion I knew, and this book taught me that. So yeah, it was a lot of closure. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
How long were you working on, you say you had a bunch of different iterations. When did you kind of begin putting a pen to the paper? Because I know you can carry these stories for a long time, but when did you start?
This literal book, I want to say it was December 18th, 2020. I was cutting weeds in the backyard because there were a lot of weeds. I bought a place that was half an acre of broom, which a friend then said, hey, that's an invasive species, you're going to want to take care of that. And I went, okay. It was also lockdowns, and I didn't know anyone here. So I would go out, and I said, I'm going to cut all of it on my own, and I'm going to do it mindfully. And so each broom plant, I would get down, like some of them were this tall, and I would cut them and be like, limiting beliefs, fear of success, and just like get in there. And I was in there, and I was like pulling the grass away, and I heard the opening line, I discarded my virginity all over the back seat of a Chevy Astrovan when I was 20. He and I had just met at a wedding reception that evening. The bride was 19 and the groom was 18. In my church, teenage weddings were pretty common. And I just sat there in my backyard with that grass and the broom and went, oh shit, is that like both like, yay, my book's here, and also, oh, That's our opening line? Like, okay. And then 50,000 words in 2 months, just like,
Wow.
which is half of the book. Just, I remember talking about it at the time. It was coming through. It was like I was getting out of the way for something that was coming through me. It was like literal floodgates. Like this river of words just flowed. It was, and that's when I was like, I couldn't deny. Okay, it's a memoir. Okay, yeah, I got out of the way. So it was two-ish years of writing and editing and manuscripts and all of that. Anybody else? I missed the other gentleman's the opportunity to answer his question, but most of it's memory. I don't have many diaries. I actually burned them all in what I called an interactive art exhibit, where I brought my diaries out that I'd moved from Nova Scotia to Ontario to BC. And I asked for everyone at the fire you could take a journal and you could flip through it and you could read from it, but you had to put it in the fire. You couldn't hand it to someone, you couldn't take a picture, nothing like that. And I burned all of them, except I found one duotang of my old school stuff, which I was able to quote from in here. And, but yeah, I feel like I had read them so many, it was like such an anchor. And I did a lot of whiteboarding and timelining of just digging back of like, when was that concert that I went to? So I was hanging out with them, so that's when that happened. And yeah, that was part of the process too, was the timeline.
So you're saying you didn't go back through your journals and
No.
look at them and gather any ideas?
I burned them in 2010. Yeah.
It's very freeing, isn't it?
It really was. I'm kind of glad I
You
didn't.
don't want anyone to read that dark side of what you had to deal with.
And there was part of it was having, again, that memory that anyone, like, Lisa, if you read something, and I did run into someone a couple years ago, I barely recognized them, and they said, "Oh, remember when you burned your diaries?" And I went, "Oh, that's, you used to have a beard. Oh, okay," like one of those, like, I don't know you. And then they told me they remember what they read. But that's kind of cool, because it's like, it was my 2010 version of an echo of like, they still carried on, but they didn't have to carry with me.
Right.
Yeah. Anybody else? Is Mickey up? Are we good?
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank
Yes,
you.
thank
Thank you.